Okay.
And okay, let me see if I'm still there. Okay. So thanks everybody for being here today. My name is Valentina Ross. I'm the office director at Church on Service. And I'm so glad to having been invited to open this presentation today. So in March 2020, as part of its COVID relief package, Congress approved the CARES Act, providing one-time payments of $1,200 to individuals earning less than $75,000 per year who filed taxes for 2018 or 2019 using a Social Security number. Many immigrants were excluded from receiving this assistance, even if they filed taxes using an IRS-issued individual tax identification number, and despite their role on the front lines as essential workers. In fact, we do know that many immigrant neighbors work in fields identified as essentials, such as healthcare, food production, agriculture, warehouses, and transportation, where during the COVID-19 pandemic, they faced heightened risk of exposure to the virus. Immigrants also make up 20% of the total workers nationwide in the hospitality industry, holding jobs such as dishwashers, cooks, servers, and domestic household labor, industries that were economically devastated through the pandemic. What is less recognized, but as you'll see in this research paper here today, it is increasingly evident, is that immigrants were disproportionately affected by shutdowns and social distancing restrictions while being excluded from the relief authorized by Congress, despite their enormous contribution to the US and local economies. And therefore, they suffered tremendous economic hardships as a consequence. Family faced eviction, food insecurity, unemployment, and childcare barriers. So in the spring and summer of 2020, CWS Lancaster partnered with the Lancaster Neighbor Fund to identify and provide emergency aid to families who were excluded from government stimulus monies and unemployment benefits because of their immigration status or their spouse's immigration status. Additional CWS funding came from the Pennsylvania Immigration and Citizenship Coalition and from a partnership between the Lancaster County Community Foundation and the United Way of Lancaster as part of the Lancaster Cares initiative. We are grateful for this partnership that brought much needed support to families in need and for the researchers we'll hear from today. So today's presentation will be led by researchers from Franklin Marshall College, who in 2021 interviewed families who had received the emergency aid from the organizations mentioned before. The scope of the research is to help us understand the various impacts of COVID-19 on these families and individuals' physical health and mental health, on their employment, finances, and safety. Presenting today are Dr. Stephanie McNulty, who is a professor of government and Latin American and Latinx studies at Franklin Marshall College. Her research focuses on democracy in Central and South America, and she's currently a long-term volunteer at CWS. Thanks, Stephanie. Roger Avila Vidal just graduated from FNM with a joint major in international studies and sociology with a minor in French. He has been a passionate advocate of immigrant rights and is currently in Nashville, where he is training to become an ESL teacher with Teach for America. Kate Espinoza is a Know Your Rights specialist in the Immigrant Children's Program at CWS Lancaster. She has been in this position for 2.5 years and with CWS Lancaster for 7 years. She currently works with minors in ORR custody to make sure they understand their rights and the immigration court system. Juliana Tamayo is a junior at Franklin and Marshall College, pursuing a Bachelor of Arts in Sociology and Government. She's originally from Ecuador and moved to the United States when she was 13 years old. This experience has led her to think critically about her roots and what it means to be an immigrant in the United States. She is currently a public policy and international affairs program fellow and a Cooperman scholar at FNM. Thanks to all of you for your important work that sheds light on the hurdles of a population that, despite their tremendous contribution to our community, and to use one of the participants' own words, often feel they live under a rug and that they live in the shadow.
Okay, thank you so much, Valentina. I'm going to share our slides now. Okay, so by the way, I put a link, not a link, but I put the actual file, the PDF of the report in the chat for anyone who wants to download it today. I'll put the link as well. But as you all know, the report itself is exploring how new Americans with precarious legal status experienced COVID in Lancaster County. So we really appreciate your interest in the report, and we also hope you will download it and disseminate it to anyone you might think is interested as well. So the main findings, which Kate and Juliana will talk about in more depth, is that immigrants experienced financial and mental health difficulties at disproportionate levels. And several early studies predicted this outcome. Our study is one of the few that provide qualitative data and narratives about the experience of this population during the pandemic. Valentina did mention that the project was born in 2020, and I do just want to after the shutdown, we realized in the Lancaster Neighbor Fund, under the leadership of Carrie Carranza, she quickly wanted us to pivot and start assisting immigrants who were not eligible for the stimulus payments, as Valentina just mentioned. So then we created this partnership, and CWS sought the additional funding to help these families survive during the shutdown. So you'll remember we were interviewing people last summer when many people were back to work, although fewer women were going back to work, and we will talk about that. There was also a brand new administration in the federal government, and people were more hopeful at that time for immigration reform. So we wanted to sort of remind you the context in which we were speaking to people. Our research methodology consisted of in-person or virtual interviews with adults for about 45 minutes to an hour to ask them about their experiences. And we are researchers located and embedded in Lancaster, but we also think that Lancaster is very typical of many areas of the country. So we think that our interviewees' experiences are generalizable to most undocumented immigrant experiences around the nation. We spoke to 26 people, all of them from Latin America and the Caribbean, and 77% of the interviewees are female, and 58% work in the food or service industry. 15% of them work in the agriculture industry. And before I hand it off to Juliana to start talking about the findings, I did want to thank first and foremost our interviewees. They've provided information that is hard to talk about. These were not easy interviews. I want to thank our research team. I've just been so impressed with this team. I've been a professor for 15 years, and I've never enjoyed a project more than I've enjoyed this one. I want to thank FNM's Center for the Sustained Engagement with Lancaster, who funded the project. And CWS and Lancaster Cares Fund also made the support to our interviews so important and helpful. So with that, I would like to pass it off to Juliana to talk about our first set of findings.
Hi, thank you, Professor McNulty, for that introduction. So for our research team identified 5 main findings relating to the financial aspects of the study. When the pandemic first started, the adults who participated in our study felt like the economic impact immediately. Some families had small savings, but most of them had, or a big part of them had to ration food and face evictions, as well as increasing debts. And on top of that, some of our participants also had to send money back to their home countries. So this also impacted their situation. Additionally, men tended to go back to work faster because women were mainly taking care of their children at home. Therefore, the pandemic seems to have triggered a she session, which caused the employment situation to deteriorate considerably more for women than men. And while the pandemic represented a challenge for Americans across the nation, it significantly impacted undocumented immigrants more due to their inability to seek public assistance. In other words, there were no public assistance programs like the stimulus checks, business recovery programs, or employment payments available to undocumented immigrants. As a matter of fact, one interviewee stated, "I felt like the world was ending at that time, mostly because we could not apply for government aid to pay for rent or other aid. We depended on ourselves to pay the rent. We had to work day to day to survive. And we unfortunately did not have the same help as other people with legal status." In addition to the lack of financial assistance, this also increased fears around penalties and financing should a person get sick, as well as fears of deportation. So if a person were to, most of our interviews stated being scared of reaching medical assistance for fear of being deported, or just also because of fear of the expensive bills that would come out of that. As a matter of fact, one interview stated, "I prefer to die in the house than go to the hospital because of the bills." Additionally, two barriers that prevented people from accessing additional assistance was that many public social services, such as rent assistance programs, require some type of identification or social security numbers from the applicants. And secondly, where local and state programs exist for any person, regardless of immigration status, this population still hesitated to ask for fear due to help of public charges stipulations. So they were scared that asking for any type of help would prevent them or present a problem in the future should they pursue some type of citizenship process. An interview stated, "The only help we received was food for our children. I did not ask for more help or money for fear of having more obstacles in the future if I am able to ask for papers. I don't want them to have a reason to think that I am a public charge." And on the other hand, while there was no national or state assistance, some financial assistance emerged from one nonprofits geared towards advocating for undocumented immigrants. For example, the Lancaster Neighbor Fund, Church World Services, or CASA. Another source was food provided by the public school systems. And a third source was local churches and food banks located in Lancaster County. One interview stated, "The small gift card arrived first. It helped me so much. Then CWS, it helped me a lot because it felt like help from Americans. Otherwise, we stayed outside the system." So those were some of the financial findings. Now, Kate will talk more about the impact on mental health.
Thank you, Juliana. Yes, so a big part of our finding was we saw increased anxiety and stress. Secondly, we saw a loss of identity. Most of the interviewees that we met with, well, all of them were adults, and most of them had come to the US looking for work, and losing work to them meant a loss of self-worth or loss of identity. By the time we spoke to them, as Stephanie said, most of them were back at work, but when they reflected on that time, they really felt like they had lost themselves for a moment. Next was a negative impact on children's mental health. For example, one person said, "COVID affected me a lot psychologically, and I would like to have had access to therapy for me and my kids. The pandemic affected my youngest the worst. We all need mental health assistance." But a lot of times people who are undocumented are afraid to ask for help or simply don't know where to look for help. They're afraid that if their children were to get help at school, that might mean that someone would look into them and into their legal status. And therefore, we're more afraid about asking for help from teachers or a counselor at school, and felt that maybe over time it would just be overcome just naturally. Thirdly, was a sense of family unity. There was an upside to being with family when people reflected back on the first couple of weeks of COVID. I think we all felt that. We all felt like we were happy that we got to spend some time together, whether our family was working or not. For example, we had one man who said that he and his son worked opposite shifts. And so they were really happy to sit together and watch movies and TV in the first couple of weeks of the shutdown. But then as time moved on and they really needed money in order to keep paying for things, or monetary needs became more prevalent, or as Juliana said, women became the main caregivers in the home, the stress really went up. And so despite the fact that they were happy to be with their children, they began to feel that burden and that anxiety of how were they going to pay the bills. Mm-hmm. And finally, we really saw a sense of hope moving forward. Every time our researcher team met, we always remarked on the fact that there seemed to be a lot of hope in people. A lot of times God was referenced, or faith in God. More people seem to have hope and trust in God to lead them through this pandemic. They would say if God brought it, then God will find us a way out. We also realized that this sense of hope comes from the fact that it was summer, it was getting warmer out, people were able to be outside, people were going back to work. And then the Biden administration, as Stephanie said, was kind of beginning to start in power. At the time, we were expecting big new immigration reform to come through that had not been stopped yet in Congress. And so there was a chance that maybe 11 million undocumented people across the US were going to get a chance at permanent residency and a path to citizenship here in the US. And that was very exciting. And finally, by this point, the stimulus checks had come out for children and spouses who were not undocumented. So even though the parents were undocumented, maybe the children were able to get a stimulus check, and that really helped boost their economic need in that moment and give them a sense of hope going forward. And I think that's it, so I'll pass it on to Roger now.
Thank you, Kate. So after we've been through a nice conversation with all the interviewees, we asked them what they would like to see when it comes to policy recommendations, what does it look like, and why they would like to receive this form of help. So the main thing that across the board, all the interviewees have mentioned is comprehensive immigration reform. So what does that look like? So it's making sure that we provide some sort of path to citizenship. Starting off the journey of legal status, this will help diminish the amount of political violence they already face and be able to access several social services and basic needs to go about their day and be able to thrive. So this will give them access and be able to work legally, as well as be able to have their driver's license and access to healthcare, which is very important, especially during a time where the pandemic has prevented them from being able to reach out for help. Additionally, we want to make sure that there is equitable assistance when it comes to these several issues that go across the world and the nation. As they mentioned, with the stimulus check, it was provided to help relieve the amount of economic stress that families and individuals face. However, it required a social security. So a lot of undocumented immigrants use a tax identification number to be able to file taxes. So despite filing, they're unable to receive any form of aid, as well as mixed status families that also prevent them from receiving any form of financial assistance. So this creates an even further strain where they're facing a lot of issues as they go around. So for the individuals, some of them said that I would simply like to work to pay bills and rent. I like to not have problems paying rent and the bills and get my papers too. I just want to help my children. Another individual said, we would like to be taken into account more as people. We feel different, afraid of our situation, and sometimes it is difficult for us to ask for help. We came to this country and would like to be considered as citizens. We hope to be taken into account and receive aid just like a regular citizen. So these several issues that they face just further alienating them as already undocumented immigrants and just being ignored. And finally, it's really important that we also take into consideration their psychological and mental health. We want to make sure that these immigrants aren't just thriving economically and socially, but making sure that they're thriving psychologically, as well as they face several political violence and other issues throughout this time. So this is what we're really hoping to push for, and we hope to see with our communities and with the future.
Okay, so you've heard from the researchers. Thank you all so much. I wanted to introduce a person we invited to discuss the implications of the report next. Dr. Cristina Perez studies the violence of U.S. immigration policy and practices. We are so fortunate to have her at F&M as an assistant professor of American Studies and Latin American and Latinx Studies. I have a longer bio. I'll just hit on a few things about Cristina for those of you who have not been able to meet her. She's a wonderful addition to our community. Before coming to FNM, she served as a National Center for Institutional Diversity Research postdoctoral fellow in women's studies at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, and a visiting assistant professor in comparative border studies at the University of California, Davis. So she is working on a book, in fact, about the immigration system and violence and space. But without taking up more time, I wanted to invite Dr. Perez to make a few comments about the report.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I want to start off by thanking Stephanie McNulty, Roger Avila Vidal, and Juliana Tamayo, both for their excellent work on this really important project and for their invitation today. I'm so excited to think alongside them and to draw connections between their work and the scholarly conversation happening in immigration studies. In reading the report, I drew 3 immediate connections between the project and some of the big work being done in the field. One, that injustice against migrants is made up of a web of violence and neglect that is often invisible to the citizens who live alongside them. 2, that these violences are exacerbated by the migration process and the ways that the movement of peoples across borders cuts them off from their families and social networks. And 3, that the nation has a long history of leveraging or taking advantage of emergencies in order to further the violent exclusion of migrants. So the first, injustice against migrants is made up of a web of violence and neglect that is often invisible to the citizens who live alongside them. At the heart of injustice against migrants is their deliberate exclusion from formal membership in the nation, or citizenship. The scholarship here is clear. Politicians may tell us that migrants remain undocumented because of the choices they made to come to the US or to stay here without paperwork. In actuality, their status as outside the nation is carefully constructed by lawmakers who refuse to make legal migration possible for so many. What is more, the nation's refusal to grant citizenship to the undocumented, to TPS status holders, and to documented migrants ripples out to affect so many facets of a migrant's life in the US. The work of McNulty, Avila Vidal, and Tamayo reminds us that injustice against migrants regularly takes the form of economic inequality, labor exploitation, a lack of access to medical care, a lack of mental health resources, a denial of educational access and or childcare, and targeting by local immigration policing. This research also tells us that legal status affects access to housing and higher education and makes migrants more vulnerable to poor health outcomes and domestic violence, which we know were a problem during the pandemic. Sociologists and Central American Studies professors Cecilia Menjivar and Laicia Abrego call these effects legal violence, which they describe as the harmful outcomes of the law in the lives of individuals. This is to say that the legal migration or the legal exclusion of migrants produces immediate and long-term social suffering. This form of violence is particularly pernicious because it is the result of legal processes. Because so many citizens think of the law as neutral, natural, and normal, we don't often see its violent effects in the lives of migrants. And yet, I think McNulty, Avila Vidal, and Tamayo effectively draw on the voices of those most affected to remind us that to deny someone access to healthcare in a global pandemic, to deny them access to mental health services in the face of isolation and depression, to deny children access to an adequate education or adults to the supplemental financial support they need as they became unable to earn a living, all of that is a form of violence and it creates suffering. And I imagine some of it was fatal. And without the work of scholars like McNulty, Avila Vidal, and Tamayo, so much of this violence would remain invisible, in part because of the violent systems from the law, in part because the violence stems from the law, and in part because immigration policing makes it difficult for migrants to draw attention to cases where their rights have been violated and when they face violence. While Menjivar and Abego coined the term legal violence in 2012 to describe the phenomenon that dates back to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 and cuts across Democratic and Republican administrations, the report reminds us that the Trump era saw an intensification of legal violence as policymakers and the president became more vocal in their attempts to prove their commitment to national and border security, both of which they deceptively argued were undermined by migrants. This environment of intensified immigration policing made it even more difficult for migrants to speak out as they faced the state's increasingly public threats of deportation, detention, family separation, and so on. Number two, these violences are exacerbated by the migration process and the ways that movement of peoples across borders cuts them off from their families and social networks. It is hard to speak about immigration in one voice. Certainly, when scholars ask migrants about why and how they migrated, themes emerge, but the truth is that the circumstances that people leave, their responses for migrating, and the conditions that they arrive in the US vary quite a bit. Still, the process of migration often, not always, but often, results in the severing of connection between families and social networks. I was struck as I read McNulty, Avila Vidal, and Tamayo's report that so many of the impacts of COVID were likely made worse for migrants who came to the US alone, those who came just with their immediate family, or those who haven't had the time or opportunity to build support networks in the community. As I read the report, I thought of the many citizens I know who created pandemic bubbles with other families, or who relied on grandparents, aunts, siblings, and cousins to watch and help guide their children through online learning. The scholarship on migrant communities in the US demonstrates migrants' resourcefulness, the ways the communities come together to fill in when the nation refuses to support them. But McNulty, Avila Vidal, and Tamayo's findings about the number of women who had to quit their jobs and those who are still unable to return to work because they lack childcare, along with their findings about the mental health impacts of so much isolation, suggests to me that migrant resources were and continue to be stretched too thin. That where citizens could fill in for a ripped social safety net, migrants struggle to do so, perhaps because they left so much of that support behind in their sending countries. And finally, the nation has a long history of leveraging or taking advantage of emergencies in order to further the violent exclusion of migrants. The third connection I drew between McNulty, Avila Vidal, and Tamayo's report and the academic literature is to the work of immigration scholar Karma Chavez, whose new work on AIDS and the scapegoating of especially Haitian migrants holds important lessons for the contemporary. In studying the AIDS crisis and comparing it to the COVID pandemic, she argues that both diseases disproportionately affected minoritized communities. And while political and civic discourses failed to adequately address the disparate death count, it was left to these communities to advocate for themselves. Meanwhile, she claims, in both the AIDS crisis and the COVID pandemic, politicians, lawmakers, and activists on the right found the opportunity to incite anti-migrant and xenophobic sentiment, to target those perceived as foreign to political ends. McNulty, Avila Vidal, and Tamayo found evidence of this in the intensified fear of hate crimes towards the migrants they interviewed. So too do I think we continue to see echoes of this approach in the fight to repeal Title 42, which allowed Trump and then Biden to turn migrants away at the border under the pretense of stopping COVID. This too is a trick we've seen before. In my own work, I consider the ways lawmakers turned to the spread of typhus into an opportunity to turn away, shame, or bathe in lye and other toxic chemicals Mexican migrants at the border. So too do I trace the government's efforts to associate Mexican migrants to sexually transmitted infections, converting border crossers into contagions from which the national body must be protected before they have the opportunity to infect the US with their law-breaking, immoral, and unhealthy behaviors. The continued use of these tactics, even as the pandemic slows, suggests to me, at least, that this valuable report is just the beginning of our understanding of the impacts of COVID on migrants and migration, and that we have a long way to go in making the US and Lancaster a more livable place for the migrants who contribute so much to our society. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Christina. I am going to stop sharing now. We wanted to leave the last part of the meeting open for discussion and questions. And so Erica Milner from CWS is going to help us moderate the next 28 minutes of the meeting. I will say that the meeting ends exactly at 1. So, but until then, we would invite put any comments or questions you have, or especially questions that could generate some more discussion in the chat. I haven't been able to check it yet, but Erica, have you seen anything at this point that we could kick us off with questions?
Yeah, there's one question there. Do you want to see my face? It says, I wonder how you handle cases of domestic violence with undocumented migrants. I believe they will not feel safe reporting that. I wonder if there are support groups that will make them feel safe. I'm factoring in cultural and religious biases. And does anyone has an idea or an expertise to answer that?
I can take this question or start it. Yes, so a lot of times people who are undocumented often feel that they can't make their voice heard and explain what is happening to them. Sometimes it is cultural, sometimes it is religious, sometimes it's just not understanding who they can turn to. Especially when we see it most is when there's a power dynamic where somebody is documented, they have DACA, they have a green card, or they're a US citizen, and their partner who is the victim of domestic violence is undocumented. The victim often feels that they just don't have any power in that situation. However, here in Lancaster, we do have Church World Service, CASA, MILPA also work with undocumented people, and they're a good community resource, and they actually are able to send people to PERC if they need legal help in York, and then also a lot of times to the YWCA here in Lancaster and in York can be incredibly helpful.
Does anyone have any follow-up? Anyone on the panel that would like to follow up?
Christina, did you have any,
Yeah, I think that's right. I think Kate's right. I think sometimes it is cultural and religious, but I think mostly it's legal, right? We have made it the fear of facing deportation after turning in a partner makes people really vulnerable. Also, right, if your partner is a citizen and has a job and you're undocumented and you don't have access to a job, right, that makes you particularly vulnerable financially. There are lots of ways of being undocumented, or even if your partner is undocumented, right, if both partners are undocumented, to turn an undocumented partner into the police means you're putting them up for deportation. How is that complicated if you have kids? How is that complicated if you want them to just get help and not be sent out of the country, right? So some of it is cultural and religious, most of it is legal. We've created those hurdles.
Okay. And the next question is, where can I find more resources about what options are available for undocumented persons to apply for legal status? It was mentioned that the government has policies in place and a plan to hinder this process. Can you elaborate on this?
Kate, yeah, maybe you want to take a stab at that too?
Sure, if somebody has questions here in Lancaster, they can always call the CWS legal intake line, and we can provide them with a $50, is it $50 now? I don't know, a consult to talk about how they came here, what their life looks like here, anything that could have happened that might be able to help them find some type of legal relief, what they could apply here. That's what can be done here in Lancaster. Or if they're not in Lancaster, often you can look up like immigration nonprofit in a zip code, and that'll help you find somebody in their area.
And any follow-up for that? Anybody from CWS want to chime in? Any other folks? The next question is from Maria. What tremendous work
I
you've
would
done-
like
Oh,
I would like to add that as every situation is different, every individual's case is different. What Kate said is what should be done, schedule a consultation with one of our legal counselors so that, the particulars of the individual's case can be assessed and reviewed. And that there is no one case that is exactly the same as another one.
And I'll just add that I think this is why we were all more hopeful last summer, because we did think that there would be more opportunities available to people who had been living here. Most undocumented immigrants pay taxes regularly. So when the opportunity to regularize their status occurs, they have their history of supporting themselves. And so that was something that I didn't know, before I started this kind of my experiences in immigration. And so I think people had been hoping that there would be a way to regularize, and there hasn't been. So if anyone has any energy to advocate for immigration reform in Congress, that would be another great action to take as well. Okay, so
and jumping off of that, sorry, I could jump in Pennsylvania specifically, one of the big things that undocumented people don't have are driver's licenses, and that's a big hindrance. And so there is a bill called Driving PA Forward, or there's a movement. I believe there's a Facebook page. And so if somebody was interested and wanted to get involved with that, I think it's been up for a couple of years, but the states near us that do have undocumented or licenses for undocumented people include Maryland, Delaware, New Jersey, New York, and then now currently in Michigan, they're going to be able to push it forward. So it definitely has momentum in our neighboring states. It's something that we could push for here in Pennsylvania as well.
anyone else jumping on? And the next one is a compliment also. What tremendous work you have done here. Thank you so much for sharing it with us. I'm interested in how you think your disproportionately female identified sample shaped your research, experiences, and findings. Thank you.
I'll take the first stab at that, and then maybe some of my researchers want to join in, but some of I shouldn't say mine, but it certainly shaped the findings. And obviously one of our findings about women going to work later than their male family members was shaped by the fact that we're speaking to more women than men. Having said that, that also was predicted and documented outside of Lancaster. So we knew that we were experiencing in real time something that was happening nationwide. And I loved that term that the New York Times coined, which is the she session. So they predicted that this she session would have a predominantly female and predominantly person of color profile. So I do think, apart from that, I don't know, I'll let the other researchers talk. In terms of the findings, we used a very, it was one of the first times I've used a very strict interview protocol. And the findings were, in terms of the financial effect and the mental health effects, men and women spoke about them consistently. So I don't think that there was more or less openness. It was more about us witnessing in real time how people had not gone to work. We did our interviews with a lot of children running around because they were actively caregiving while we were doing the interviews. And so, which is of course I loved, but so I definitely, for me, it really affected the experience, but B, really confirmed what the national conversation about this she session that was happening. But I'll let other people jump in now.
I can also add that it does kind of provide that additional insight to seeing the inequities that come with gender minority individuals. So being able to see, and I believe it was Latinx identifying women are one of the more lower paid individuals when it comes to gender wage gap. So looking at specifically immigrant women, many of them being Latinx identifying, able to see and understand this additional issue that still is another conversation that needs to be had as well in conjunction and intersecting identities. So with having a lot of these individuals, interviewees being women, it provides an additional step and component to this conversation of making sure we provide equity when it comes to earnings for women across the country.
Is there anyone else?
I would just add that I think immigration literature has for a long time ignored the voices of women. We thought of migration as largely a process undertaken by men. And when we went to study it, because we studied immigration and labor, we thought about men and labor and immigration. And I think this report does something really interesting in adding women's voices, not just as mothers and caretakers, but also as laborers who were unable to go back because of mothering and caretaking. And so I think there's an important dynamic there that that this report attends to.
The next question is, did interviewees speak to the ways that they were able to access COVID-19 information? For non-English speakers, was it difficult to gain knowledge about the pandemic or even apply for assistance? Did this contribute to their inability to access resources?
Juliana had to go to her another program, but Kate or Roger, did you want to talk about that?
Yes, so some of the families I spoke to were just already like really worried about this pandemic and just it happening. And so finding this information, it seems like for some of them, it was mainly kind of seeing what their kids were receiving in their papers and kind of the notifications. And that's another fortunate thing is for the students that are either in ESL classes or speak a lot better in English, having to mature now even faster. That's already an issue that a lot of immigrant students or students from immigrant parents already face. And now both that may probably cause additional stress for the kids to have to translate all this information to their parents. So that's just one thing that I did notice with just a few families. I don't know about the other my other members and what they heard, but additionally, just kind of hearing a little bit on the news, Spanish speaking television is kind of what they were able to receive a lot of their information from.
And I think in terms of applying for assistance, most people who are undocumented just tend to err on the side of I don't qualify because I am undocumented. And so for a lot of the time, they just erred on the side of like, I'm not going to ask for help. But a big problem going into that pandemic for a lot of people, even if they had their residency that we faced with Church World Service, or we saw from Church World Service, was the public charge questions. There seemed to be a lot of like questions about if I apply for help, will I be a public charge? Will I be able to stay in the US? Will I be deported despite having a permanent residency? And so all of that gossip or just unknown facts tended to be spread around the community completely. And so everybody seemed to think there might be an issue with public charge. And even when that went away, and we at Church World Service and across Lancaster worked really hard to make sure that people understood public charge is no longer an issue, there still seemed to be that lingering fear that the government might just come back for them because their kids were able to access a public service, or their kids who even are US citizens were able to access something, and they themselves were worried that if in the future, as we saw in the presentation, in the future they were able to get benefits, they wouldn't qualify for any type of legal relief.
And I just wanted to add that at Church World Service they were partnering with many of the crisis providers through United Way, for example, and trying to quickly translate a lot of services. And we worked hard in the Lancaster Neighbor Fund to try to get as many of them translated. One of the things that, I was just so struck writing this report of how important the assistance was, the monetary assistance, but also people repeatedly spoke about the schools and the churches and how much help they got in those first few months. And actually, we were talking to people months, a year later. But I think a lot of my Spanish speaking interviewees had gotten church assistance from churches where people do speak Spanish. And, the schools, I think we just need to do a shout out to the educators, in the past 2 years, because I remember one family telling me that a teacher went to their house and told them where to go and pick up the boxes of food that the school district was giving out to students. And they were not asking for identification. And a lot of, in Lancaster, more, some of the food places and rent assistance were asking for identification. And that is an immediate deterrent for families that we talk to, because even though the provider may not think that they mean to do anything related to immigration status, someone who does not have a driver's license or social security card is very hesitant. And Kate just said that, right? So I was really struck by the teachers and the school district and the churches and how much they were taking care of our community, in addition to the nonprofits.
Any other comments on that? Yeah. And Kate leaves a comment. I'm sure there's a question in there as well. The current housing crisis is another big issue related to domestic violence, as many women cannot afford to move out on their own. Being undocumented makes your housing and financial support opportunities even slimmer.
Yes, I agree with that. And I think, as we saw in the report with the She session, a lot of women became reliant on their husbands or their male partner in order to, or just their partner in order to be able to provide for themselves or their families. Another thing that happens in Pennsylvania a lot is because we have so many farm workers, a lot of times farmers or not family members of the main farmer will rent out housing to their workers. And so not only could that person maybe be lost without housing, but if their spouse is the main worker, and then they might feel like they need to be able to support that person in their job in order to continue with housing. So by losing housing, they really feel like they could lose out on everything if they're not working, if their housing comes through the work. That's also a big problem we've seen for farm workers as well, is oftentimes they'll live in really poor conditions because their technically their boss or somebody in charge just doesn't want to maintain and keep updated, and they're not sure how to speak out on that in terms of landlord agreements and such.
Anyone else? And Sarah writes, I'm relatively new to the area, so I was curious what Lancaster has done locally besides this research project and the things mentioned today to take action on this issue. Do we want to talk about?
Yeah,
that as well?
probably Kate and Roger would be good to answer that.
Well, Stephanie, can you speak on the Lancaster Neighbor Fund?
Sure. Yeah. So, Sarah, the Lancaster Neighbor Fund exists to offset costs of bond and detention for families who have been deported. It started about 5 years ago when the Trump administration made promises to deport so many people. But there are a lot of other resources. Well, not a lot, unfortunately, but there are some. So, and Kate and Roger know them more than me.
If you want to speak, go ahead.
Yeah, other resources seems to be a lot more so organizations and communities. A large portion comes from churches because a lot of these individuals are affiliated with religion, mainly Christianity or Catholicism, and they have a really strong connection. As you see in the report, that a lot of them, I think every single one of them has mentioned at least once, and seeing how much hope they have from that. And so a lot of churches actually provided some form of food, some provide clothing, other forms of assistance, or just information of other organizations they can go to. For example, Church World Service is one that they often mention. And so a lot of the assistance does come from the community, mainly through the churches where it's predominantly Latinx identifying.
Right. If you're looking into getting into supporting immigrants. So like I said before, things to look forward to or things to look into would be the Driving PA Forward Act for driver's licenses for undocumented people or people who are in between status. And then also we're coming up on our 10th anniversary of DACA. So children who were brought here to the US and are in undocumented status, every year we hear that Congress is going to move forward with something and every year they don't. So it's a good thing to continue to push that forward. And then finally, the farm worker bill was talked about and then kind of dropped during the pandemic or when we thought that those 11 million people might get legal relief. And so pushing again for a farm worker bill would be really helpful to Pennsylvania specifically as well.
We have 8 minutes left. So do you want to take another question or do you want to just do like closing statements?
I like to spend it most on questions, so let's take a couple more.
Okay. Another impact of people's mental health was having family members sick and unable to access care in their home country and not being able to travel back to see them or attend funerals because of their immigration status.
I would just say we definitely heard a lot of stories about how frustrating it was to people because they couldn't go home. I mean, I took this out of the report, but I had a little bit of a paragraph rant type thing at one point that was like, you know, there was so much, as Christina mentioned, there was so much xenophobic rhetoric about the immigrants and how problematic immigrants were at the time. And this still exists, of course, but and I was thinking, like literally airports are closed in most countries. And so even, I'm not someone who thinks I think we should have open borders, but it's like, even if you wanted people were stuck here, they couldn't leave. And so that was, people did talk a lot about being very worried about their family at home, needing to support them with any money they had. And also, and how hard that was. I would say that added to the anxiety and the higher levels of psychological distress. But
does anyone else have something to say about that statement? And that was does anyone have another question that they would like to add to the chat right now that you're dying to have our lovely panel answer? Because that would be our last.
One more question, if anyone has
One more question. Well, and as you're thinking of your excellent question to put on the chat, Matt says, amen to that. Kate did an amazing job, amazing work advocating to Senator Toomey about supporting that work. Even conservative members of Congress have gone for the farm workers bill, and yet it hasn't passed. So.
If there are no more questions, I'm happy to wrap up. Oh, Annalisa. Okay, we have last question. I love this one. This is a great way to end. And sorry, Eric, I just took over the chat.
Do it. You got it.
So what was the discovery that most surprised you? So I'll pick on Roger and Kate first.
Roger, go ahead. I'm still formulating.
Something that surprised me the most. I guess it's a little tricky to say, mainly because I do come from like a mixed status family, and like the interviews felt very kind of like just something that I'm like, oh, I understand that because that's what my family is going through. That's what I'm going through. So it's difficult to just say like what surprised me, because these issues, the stress, the things that we're facing is just kind of right there, right in my household. And so it's like studying my family over and over again every single time I'm reading one of the reports that either Professor McNulty, Kate, or Yolanda kind of coming back with. But I guess probably one of the biggest ones is the strongest connection of religion. That's something that just continues through all of them. So it's great for them to have that community and see how much they rely on that, and how their churches, they feel very comfortable that they can still go to them during such a major issue like the pandemic. But yeah.
Great, thanks. For me, I think it was just the support that everybody in Lancaster was able to give. It is definitely hard. I worked before as a paralegal in church world service and often had to turn away people saying, unfortunately, there's nothing, or you can't go to this organization because I know that they asked for a social security number, but just We just got an amazing amount of support from PA Immigration Relief, and then also from United Way, and then churches, and so many amazing people who just really wanted to reach out and see how they could help those who were not as fortunate as them during this. And I really appreciate that from the Lancaster community.
I think I'm going to do two, Annalisa, that won't surprise you because I like to talk more. But on the positive side, I've already said this, I was pleasantly surprised to see how many people were helping in terms of churches and nonprofits and schools. And, you know, of course, everyone wanted to help more and everyone was constrained, but there was that was really nice as an interviewer. Something that was hard to grapple with, and one of the quotes in the report just talks about the cruelty of the Trump's administration's decision to not give a stimulus check to any mixed status family. And so it was not only undocumented immigrants themselves, but if their children were born in the US, the children's citizens were not able to receive funds until the Biden administration. And so that just seemed, and you know, Christina talked about this earlier as well, just this unnecessary cruelty to go beyond any sense of humanity in my mind. I don't know, that was one of the things that really surprised me. But and I hate to end on that kind of negative note, but I should have started with the negative and started. But there were, I mean, you know, I was always surprised at how helpful and friendly and how willing people were to share their stories with us. So I'm very grateful about that. And I guess with that, I will end today by also saying I'm very grateful to all of you for sharing your time with us and sharing your interest in this issue. And we will try to, you know, please do advocate for this population any way you can. You can donate to local organizations. You can make calls to advocate for the bills that Kate has mentioned. So it's important work, and we have such an amazing community. So I appreciate your interest. Thank you, CWS. Thank you, FNM. And thank you all of you for coming. Thanks to Roger, Kate, Juliana's not here anymore. Thanks to Erica. Thanks to Dr. Perez for such amazing conversation. And with that, I think I will end the meeting. Thanks, everyone. And
thank you, Stephanie, for this
Thank
amazing.
you. Everyone have a wonderful week.